Hello, happy MLK Day, everyone. My name is Lawrence Arbuthnot, and I'm kicking things off today before passing the mic over to our event moderator and our esteemed panelists. Today's event is an important day here in the US and around the world. And given the recency of Haitian Independence Day on January 1st, we're excited to bring you a collaboration between two important Haitian organizations, the New York-based Haitian Times and Haiti-based Fonkoze, an organization that has been empowering everyday Haitians, in particular women and the rural poor, for nearly 3 decades. Today also is the first of a series of live virtual programming that the Haitian Times plans to bring to you all year round. So today we're joined by Professor Marlène Do, Professor of African Diaspora Studies and Associate Director of the Carter G. Woodson Institute of AFAM and African Studies at the University of Virginia. We're also joined by Karine Rona, Executive Director of the Fonkoze Foundation. And today's conversation will be moderated by Macaulay Neal, Managing Editor of the Haitian Times. For questions, which we'll have time for at the end of the conversation, we'll be fielding those in the chat. So feel free to pop your questions into the chat. I'll communicate them to our moderator, Macaulay, and then we'll go from there. So with that, let me pass it over to Macaulay. Thank you so much. Enjoy the event.
Thank you, Larry, and thank you everyone for joining. I'm curious to know in the poll what some of you said about how you first heard about 1804 and Haitian independence, and we'll have a look at those shortly. But just to get into it, to set the scene, to make sure everyone is on the same page, the Haitian Revolution really is a movement that has captured the imagination of freedom seekers, activists, advocates for liberation, and certainly writers and authors and historians all over the globe. And we've seen it in books, in movies, in plays, and most recently, during the Black Lives Matter protests, we saw it at a lot of rallies. And so over the past summer, doing the work that the Haitian Times has done, we saw our red and blue flag all over the place. We saw drums. We saw all those giant Haitian drums just leading the way forward across all these cities in the US. We've also seen the words 1804, those numbers just stamped on t-shirts, murals, merchandise, just so much of it, so many placards all over. And so we started wondering, what does January 1st, 1804, Haitian Independence Day, really mean in the context of the social justice movements that we're a part of at this time? And so today, as we look at honoring Dr. King and his legacy, the legacy of the civil rights movement, we really thought it would be a good time to just stop and ask, what does Haitian independence mean in today's context? Is what we're seeing today the evolution of that revolution we had 270 years ago? And then lastly, if we have time, we'd love to get some thoughts on how we as Haitian Americans can continue to uphold that legacy in the movements that we're a part of for future generations. We don't have a lot of time, so I'm gonna start with our two esteemed panelists, Dr. Do and Karine Rona, and I'll start with you, Dr. Do. Tell us just very briefly what the Haitian independence movement was about and what is the legacy of that movement.
Oh, thank you so much. I want to thank everybody for inviting me here, the Haitian Times and Fonkoze for sponsoring this, and our wonderful hosts. It's really an honor to be here. I love reading the articles in the Haitian Times, and it's just so great to see so much knowledge being disseminated sort of all around, especially in the Haitian diaspora. So thank you for your work. The Haitian Revolution, of course, we know culminates in 1804 with Haitian independence, but I want to take us back a moment, maybe I thought today, since probably a lot of our audience participants know the ins and outs of the Haitian Revolution really well. I want to go back to January 20th, 1758, because at this MLK Day, for some reason, this state jumped out at me because January 20th, 1758 is when Macandal, Francois Macandal, was burned at the stake outside a square in Cap Français. And so there's so many different stories about how exactly it happened. Before I get into that, I want to say I'm a person who thinks in kind of symbols and connections. And I just thought, oh, MLK, like all the letters that are in that make the sounds of Makandal. And so it just jumped out to me, the symbolism of the date, the name, the initials. But of course, Makandal had been engaged in raids and poisonings in colonial Saint-Domingue, colonial Haiti, and he was captured with fetiches, what the colonists called the fetiche on his body. And so these were kind of amulets, and they used these in the trial that they gave to him to convict him. But when Makandal, of course, jumped into the fire, the sort of story is that he transformed himself into a mosquito and flew away. But it's interesting because the colonial accounts of the colonists at the time say that actually he jumped out of the fire, really, truly jumped out of the fire, and they had to throw him back in. But because of the commotion that was caused, hardly anyone saw it. And so that's where the idea comes from, that did he really actually get burned at the stake? What happened? Because there was such commotion and they had to clear the space that only a few people actually remained as witnesses. So that was the first event that I wanted to talk about. The second I wanted to talk about is really how novel the laws that came about in the wake of the Haitian Revolution were. One of the founders of the Haitian Studies Association, the US-based Haitian Studies Association, Claudine Michel, she says that Haitian independence and the Haitian Revolution is the original Black Lives Matter movement. And I've been thinking a lot about that because, of course, in Toussaint's constitution, with one word, he changes the world, and that is by saying that slavery is forever abolished. Because I've seen so much in the French context of the French saying, we're the first nation to abolish slavery. And it's like, yes, but you reestablish it 6 years later. So in 1794, of course, the French National Convention abolishes slavery, but Napoleon reinstates it in Guadeloupe and allows it to flourish in Martinique in 1802. And so with that word, forever, permanently, Toussaint Louverture changes the world. Then Dessalines comes and issues a new constitution for the Empire of Haiti, and not only reiterates that slavery can never exist anywhere in this territory, anywhere in this land, but he also says we have to eliminate color prejudice. There's no way, we're not going to recognize distinctions in color because recognizing distinctions in color leads to color prejudice. And I think a lot about that because what he was talking about is the hierarchies that were baked into the ideas of color that people had in the 18th and 19th century. So it wasn't really about recognizing difference. It was that the very words that were attached to those differences were just laden with hierarchy. And so when we go back to the original laws of Haiti, I focus on what the founders of Haiti were trying to do, the world that they were trying to create, which is a very different world that we can own, that we have now across the world. But I do think going back to the world that they wanted is really, really important, especially because it highlights how hard it was to create that world. And so on this MLK Day, I want to point out that African-Americans, US African-Americans, always supported Haitian independence in the early 19th century. They supported Haitian sovereignty. They saw it as a beacon. And so even though there's so much scholarship that talks about how fearful the world was of Haiti, there was a certain portion of the world that had slavery, the world that was pro-colonial. But certainly for US African-Americans, for Black people in Brazil, we know in Martinique and Guadeloupe, they weren't afraid of Haiti. They wanted to become Haiti. They were hoping that Haiti would be visited upon them. And I think of Fernand Hibert in I think it's 1907, his novel Les Tazards, says, when will a Dessalines visit North America to grant true liberty and equality to the Blacks of the United States? And of course, this was after a character in the novel is reading about another Black person being lynched in Georgia. And so this summer, what we saw sort of come to a fore with these Black Lives Matter protests, to me, are a kind of Makandal spirit, a Dessalinian spirit, a Cécile Fatiman spirit, a Sanité Belair spirit, which is to say that that I hope we keep the revolutionary movement alive, and I hope we keep the dream alive, not just that Martin Luther King Jr. had, but that the Haitian revolutionaries had, because we know that Martin Luther King Jr. read about and understood and admired the Haitian Revolution as well. And so to me, these are all on a long sort of line together and mutually informing and influencing how we can think about this Haitian Independence Day that just passed, this celebration of Martin Luther King Jr.'s birthday and the upcoming anniversary of the execution of François Macandal, who in some ways lays a kind of groundwork for Bois Caïman, where they would evoke his name at the ceremony of Bois Caïman. So I will end there. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. I learned so much that I hadn't ever heard before. Specifically where you said that the Haitian Revolution was the original Black Lives Matter movement. That's certainly one way to look at it. So along those lines, Karen, let me bring you in to talk a little bit about what it's been like, right? In terms of that progression. Once you're out of physical bondage and you're building a nation of freed people, what are some of the challenges that show up in that work, and how does Fonkoze help now in the modern day to help address them?
Okay, thank you everyone for your presence here and for giving me the opportunity to share a bit of what we do with Fonkoze in Haiti. Fonkoze stands for Fondation Collées Épaules, or Shoulder to Shoulder Foundation. And it's a Haitian organization founded by a Haitian priest, Père Joseph Philippe, and a group of grassroots leaders back in 1994. And, it was October, it was like the middle 1994, it was well before the President Aristide came back, so it was in the middle of the coup d'etat. But Father Joseph is a very, very driven personality, and he said, there's just too much of a pays en dehors. There's so many people in Haiti who are outside of what a lot of people call the Republic of Port-au-Prince, who don't have access to even the basic financial services. And so what they wanted to do was to create a bank for the poor, essentially to give the poor people in rural areas in Haiti the tools they needed to create wealth for their communities. Now, today, 26 years later, still only 22% of Haitian adults have a bank account, but many, many, many more have access to financial services through credit unions and microfinance institutions like Fonkoze. Our microfinance institution, which is Service Financier Fonkoze, provides services to close to 200,000 people all over the country through branches, 44 branch offices, most of which are absolutely not in the cities like the other major banks. Mm-hmm. And I'm not with the bank, I'm actually working with the foundation, the Haitian nonprofit. What we do is we provide support through training, health services, accompaniment to help people use financial services and grow their businesses and really take control of their lives. Mm-hmm. Because that's really what this is about, is to provide the tools people need to take control of their lives.
Okay, so in a way, it's a little bit like empowering disenfranchised communities, right? Which we can draw a line with some of what we're experiencing in the United States, or actually worldwide. Is that right?
That's exactly what it is. And it was for Father Joseph and his friends at that time, it was specifically for people, rural Haitians, and then especially rural women in Haiti.
Mm-hmm. Wow. So tell us then, what goes into actually doing that work, like at a tactical level, right, on the ground? How do you go from, looking around and saying we need to do something to actually doing it? What does it take to actually get that work done? Like who do you need to be part of that team to stand shoulder to shoulder with, as you said?
The very first thing we need is the 1,000 people who are our staff members, especially the credit agents, the field agents, the case managers, the people who every day get onto their motorcycle and drive an hour, 2 hours into the hills in Port-au-Prince to meet with the credit agents, to meet with the ultra poor women they work with, and provide them with services. It's training, it's opportunities to save, it's learning how to take care of a goat they just received, It's really that day-to-day making sure you go out and meet with the people. And you don't let anything deter you from that. So there's a hurricane, okay, we stop for a few days until the floods are down and we start over again. There's pays loc, you can hardly move around. Okay, what they do is they call the local leaders they work with. They say, okay, what road do I best take today? Is that road open? Is that road open? And they just go. All through the pays loc in 2018, all through COVID in 2020, we never stopped providing our services. And that's also that spirit of determination, of courage. We provide services. We really, really are important in people's lives. And so we can't let anything but a really major thing deter it from doing what we need to do.
Mm-hmm. That's really admirable work. It sounds like, you have a whole workforce that you work with. I assume paid and unpaid volunteers as well that you work with. And that sounds just like an incredible amount of work. So I'm curious to know, and this one is for Dr. Doe, what are some of the parallels do you find in studying the history of Haiti, post-revolution and through the centuries that has led to its current condition? What are some of the parallels that you see between our development and some of the challenges that disenfranchised communities in the United States face?
Oh, interesting. Yes. I mean, I think I would refer to Michel Rouve-Trouillot here, not silencing the past, not even state against nation, but Tidi fait bouler sous histoire Haïti. There's this resonant passage where he talks about how the problems facing Haiti were very similar to the problems facing, he said, Martinique. He evoked Africa and the United States, and he said that there's a sector of society that's wearing the cloak of an elite, and then there's a sector of society that's wearing the cloak of the indigenous. And he said the problem is exploitation, and it's the exploitation of an elite, of a sort of native population. And indigenous population was the word he used, but he meant that in terms of sort of the indigenous movement, indigeneity. And I think that these are parallel problems. In the United States, African Americans are disenfranchised compared to the larger white population, but also compared to many other groups, people who identify as people of color, for example, Asian Americans, and some sectors of the Latinx population as well, depending on which cities and which states. And but I wouldn't want to draw too sharp of comparisons, because I think it's really important that Haitians have been in charge of their nation for a really long time, but have also been subjected to forms of neocolonialism that are actually very different from what African Americans experience. And neither one is worse or better. They have drastically different consequences, though, because Haiti's position in the world order is, in a sense, to be punished by a capitalist world order if Haitians don't sort of adhere to it. And so I was hearing what Karine was saying about the kind of determination and the kind of projects. And the thing I really like about that is that taking what Haitians want to do, how they want to participate in an economy that they create, and allowing that to flourish, instead of saying what happens under neoliberalism, which is let's bring in factories, and what does that do is just replicates elites exploiting the masses for their own gain, and a few people get rich, and that's the capitalist world order. And so Haiti is both a macrocosm and a microcosm of that, because of course the United States is the capitalist state par excellence, but you see that some Black people, because Black capitalism has existed for a long time here, can reach the kind of top and pinnacle of that order, and then it looks like it's possible for everyone else. And I think that in Haiti, especially right now, it's more apparent that the obstacles, it's not actually about individual determination, though, because you can succeed on your own and live, but the structural problems that we see with a very tiny elite prevent the vast majority of the population from thriving and enjoying basic human necessities, I would say.
So I'm curious to know, how does that manifest in the day-to-day? Like, can you tell us maybe one or a couple stories about people that you've helped that, were, I don't want to say victims, but who were really having a hard time just, elevating, right? Like rising from poverty, um, just from the structure of the country, the lack of infrastructure, all of the problems that we could go on and on and on and list. Tell us how you've helped a couple families or women that you helped through your programs to rise above those challenges.
What we've learned is that extreme poverty is like a trap. It's a trap that is both due to, like you said, the environment, the infrastructure, the lack of education. It's also the mindset. It's also a lack of social capital. So very often when we work with ultra poor women, these are women either because they were born in that environment or very often because they hit a big shock, such as a death in the family of a breadwinner or a major conflict in a community. These women, they kind of lost hope, and they live from really one meal to another, trying to keep themselves and their kids fed. And what I've seen is that really, when you help these women through an integrated package of asset transfers and training, but also working with local leaders so that they won't be alone, helping them to rebuild their homes so that they will have dignity, and help them send their kids to school. It's that package of services together that helps them overcome that initial trap. And then we have really ample evidence that the vast majority of them can continue growing after that. But Matt, I think one of the key elements is that you have to believe it's possible. If you don't believe that such an extremely, extremely poor, isolated rural woman without education can take control of her life, you won't go anywhere. And I think that's maybe one of the big challenges we're facing here in Haiti today, is that not a lot of people believe in Haiti anymore. And that's a real pity because of the incredible thing they did in 1804. And because all the courage and the determination they show individually.
Mm-hmm.
But just, the way Dr. King managed to create that movement, really mobilizing a whole range of people from a wide variety of backgrounds, we would need something like that. And the first thing would be someone or someone's who can make us all believe in it again.
Wow. I can't help but, think that a lot of what you're describing sounds like some of the terms we use here in the US when we talk about Black Lives Matter, and the work to eradicate racial inequality, health inequity, all of the systemic inequality that we've been talking about, and that's been part of the conversations we're having, certainly throughout the whole year. I'm curious to know, so you say the belief, in the possibility of that overcoming that initial trap is really crucial in getting that work done. That to me sounds like a lot of the positioning, I've heard around allyship and bringing people into the fold to help you or help other people who may not have, like you said, the social capital or the mindset to overcome. How do you guys feel, ladies, feel about that? I'm curious to know your comments on that piece. And then I think we can go to questions.
I mean, well, I would say I agree that there is a component that involves individual mindset and also breaking patterns. But I also do think the rest of the world, and the United States in particular, has to take their foot off Haiti's neck. It's just not fair to tell someone to keep hoping that they can get up if you're literally holding them down. And the idea that I just find the way that US politicians discuss Haiti for a long, and have been discussing Haiti for a long time, to be both paternalistic and patronizing. Like, Haitians just need to help themselves, they'll say in one breath, at the same time basically installing a leader or making conditions so that their preferred candidate wins an election, and turning and closing their eyes to obvious problems in elections and obvious corruption and theft. And I do think that unless the international community decides to back away, and the pressure, and that maybe, you know, that this is something that U.S. African Americans and people who are a part of the Haitian diaspora like me can do, is to not just protest for Black Lives Matter in the United States, but for around the world, and to keep the pressure on the U.S. government to back off, and on the United Nations to back off, to the extent that individual volition would matter more, and collective community action in Haiti would matter more. And I think that means educating the US populace also a little bit more about what is happening in Haiti and how it is related to world affairs, and is not just, because people will say, how did they go from 1804 to now? And that is a huge question that has a really long and complicated answer.
Right. You know, these are actually really great perspectives to keep in mind, both the individual aspect, the mindset, what you can do, and how far you can actually get when you have systemic oppression just holding you down. So thanks for sharing those comments. I think that's really important. I do see a couple questions. I'll give the panelists a break for a little bit and go to a couple questions that have come in. Larry, I see one here. Someone wondered which organization Karine is with. And she said in the beginning she's with Fonkoze. I believe that's fonkoze.org, Fonkonze. Is that right? Awesome. We have another one here in 1804. This one is from Matt Bevins. Matt, I'm curious to know where you're joining from. So when you get a moment, do share that with us. The question is, how did the world react to Haiti's independence? And how did that reaction impact Haiti's ability to develop in the years that followed through today? So I think that that one is for you, if you could take it.
Sure. So, I mean, reactions, I always stress this because I think it's really important, but reactions to Haitian independence were not at all unilateral. There were not just US African-American free Blacks from the United States who supported Haitian independence, but Northerners sometimes did as well, because they wanted to trade with Haiti. And so they actually argued that the US government should recognize Haitian sovereignty so that they could get and try to create more favorable kind of tariffs. But of course, we know that when Jefferson comes to the presidency, he does install a trade embargo against Haiti, but it's very unpopular, which is why when it expires, it's actually not renewed, and there was an illicit trade that happened anyway. So there is a difference between the way that governments and the way that people treated Haiti. It's also true that people in the southern United States, especially those who were enslaving people, did fear Haiti. They did not want refugees to come into their communities, especially if they were bringing the people they were enslaving with them, who they had, kind of brought with them when they escaped from French Saint-Domingue. Then there's England. England also trades with Haiti, is Haiti's greatest trading partner in the 19th century. And there are British abolitionists like Thomas Clarkson and William Wilberforce who argue that the King of England should formally recognize Haitian independence. But the interest in slavery is so strong that even after France exacts, of course, as we know, in an exorbitant sum, in 1825, the agreement was 150 million francs as the price of recognition of Haitian independence. Even after that, England does not recognize Haitian independence until England abolishes slavery in their colonies. And so this becomes the most important factor for how nations of the world are going to treat Haiti, the other nations, is whether or not they are enslaving nations themselves. And so we consistently see that in the United States, it's not until after the Civil War starts, so in 1862, 1 year after it starts, that the United States is going to formally recognize Haitian independence. So it's only when slavery is inevitably going away that nations will recognize it. Other nations like Germany and Russia saw opportunities, and this is for ill or for good, mostly for ill. In Haiti, they had some of their citizens move, especially from Germany to Haiti, to try to start businesses, and also Lebanon and Syria. And so there were just, it depends on the moment in time. But after slavery ends in the United States, the US really starts to have an eye on Haiti as a country without an overseas empire, traditional overseas empire. They start to turn their eye to the Caribbean, to the Dominican Republic. And so I would say that those two factors, the indemnity, the long path to recognition, and then the imperial, not just gaze, but then also troops coming in the US occupation, have really affected Haiti and impeded its ability materially, not just symbolically, to prosper into the 20th century.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's certainly something we've heard and seen examples of over and over in the past 217 years. So then going back to you, Karine, with the impact that has on the lives of day-to-day people, right? We're curious to know, like, how organizations such as yourself, Fonkoze, how do you actually operate in this context to be able to inspire hope in their beneficiaries and supporters? That's a question from an attendee. Like, how do you actually make that happen, where you get them to feel inspired to continue supporting the work?
I think we're fortunate in a whole number of ways. And the first way is that we have quite a number of faithful supporters and people who continue to fund our work, even though things are not always very clear. You know, you have to be flexible when you work in an environment like Haiti. You have to be able to say, okay, the original plan was to go from A to B through C. Well, you know, roads are blocked, there's a flood, there's a demonstration, a manifestation. Doesn't work like that. You have to do it in another way. Or your calendar shifts, or you have to hire more people than what you had initially planned. So having a whole range of people who support us and who are actually really willing to listen to, and to accept that the reality is reality, and to who actually you have to work with that. I think that's the first thing that makes our work possible. The second thing I think is also that we're Haitian. So we work in Haiti with the Haitian community, and we learn from them and how they manage their environment. Like I was saying, in some of the rural areas where we work, where we have credit centers, the credit agents call the local women to ask them, okay, how's the road? Is it safe? Is it not safe? If it's not safe, some of the women will actually say, okay, it's not safe. Let me come to the branch. You can't come up here because people don't know you, but I can come to the branch and collect the reimbursements and the savings of the people. You see, so it's really, I think it's the supporters we have, but it's also the fact that we are Haitians in Haiti, and that we are, you know, poisson crasé dans bouillon. We're just like any other person in Haiti, working in Haiti. And so we can adapt way more easily to the local realities. I think that's essentially what makes this possible. Plus, you have to know where you want to go. Our objective is to empower people. And, you know, that's also the thing. When you get a lot of a very uncertain environment, sometimes the wind pushes you left, the wind pushes you right. If you don't know where you go, you end up any other place. So it's very important that we have donors who support us. We get funding from governments and from individuals, but we learn from the people we work with what they need. And that is what we do to empower them.
That's excellent. So have a goal and just be ready to adapt and get really creative in making sure that you get to where you're going. I think that really speaks to the how do you say, l'esprit débrouillardiste that we grow up learning about, for débrouiller. Yeah, for dégager, for débrouiller. We have a few more questions about 1804, but in the essence of time, we won't get to all of them. I will ask a couple though, because I see one person here has been very persistent in asking this question over and over. So back in 1804, what did the Haitians have to lean on as precedents or inspiration, for themselves? Like when and I get this question, when you're trapped, like physically, not just mentally, how do you even overcome and get out of that to the point where you're turning into a Macandal or Toussaint, Boukman, and all of our other heroes and the people they brought along with them?
Well, I think I'd like to focus my answer on this on marronage, because I think that marronage did teach the other Haitians who weren't able to get themselves free at that particular moment that the best way to do so was in their own hands. So Boiron Tonnerre in his 1805 memoir. So he has this resonant line at the end, and he says, and what you can learn from the history of Dessalines is that what the slaves of all the other nations can learn from the history of Dessalines is that the keys to that liberty that we have are in your own hands. And to me, it's a resonant statement because another Haitian writer from the 19th century, Baron de Vaté, who wrote a lot of histories in the 19th century, talks about the moment that the Leclerc expedition came to Haiti in 1802, right? And he says, whereas, and includes himself, whereas Toussaint Louverture, Dessalines, Christophe, all of the sort of elite generals were trying to negotiate. They're sending missives back and forth. They try to negotiate. He says, the brave Maroons of the forest, comma, the real authors of liberty and independence took one look at armed whites and they retreated back to the forest and went to go get their weapons, right? Like they never believed in this ruse. And he said that it took a while for the elite generals to figure out that doing it the European way with treaties and negotiations back and forth wasn't going to work. Look what happened to Toussaint Louverture when he tried to negotiate with constituted authority. And so I think that the precedent that Haitians had, even though so many people said it was back in France in the French Revolution, it really wasn't. It was in the marronage that they saw every day, and in people like Macandal, who defied authority and lived the principle of freedom or death. They just actually lived it. It wasn't a slogan. And as one of my colleagues says, how many people today would dare actually say those words and mean it, fully? And I think that that every person, we also tout moun c'est moun, every person is a person, and it seems so simple, and yet the Haitian revolutionaries actually lived that principle out. And as Vaté said, the Maroons of the forest. So that's what I would say. That was their precedent.
That's wonderful. There's so much, deeper history I hadn't heard before. Dr. Joe, you've gone so far back, and I think it'll be interesting for our attendees to have these resources that you mentioned here this afternoon. So I think we are almost at time. So for anyone who needs to log off, we are going to send a follow-up email with some resources for you to go through and just study up, help do the research yourself, and just become more informed about the history of the revolution and why it's such a great inspiration to so many in the modern day. So we do have a few more questions. So if everyone is okay with staying, we could stay a little bit longer before we wrap. Is that okay? Good. Yeah, I'm curious to know, the US presidential inauguration is coming up in 2 days. So we have a couple questions around, what Haitians can look for as we face this new administration, and just what people in the US as Haitian Americans or friends of Haiti can do to continue applying pressure, as you said, Dr. Doe, on getting the US and the UN and all of these different organizations and states to give Haiti a chance in a way. Do you want to tackle those two kind of together?
I'm interested to see what Karine, I'm interested if Fonkoze works with the Haitian government at all, if that has been effective. Have you found any movement or any sort of I guess, openings that could help, or any advice you could give about approaching the Biden administration. I hope that because Kamala Harris has Caribbean origins, that maybe she might be interested in a different relationship with Haiti than the US has had.
Fonkoze works with the government, but specifically with more technical administrations. Like, for example, we work with the Ministry of Social Affairs to integrate our ultra-poor program in the National Social Protection Policy. We work with the Ministry of Health because we work with our volunteers to identify malnourished children and refer them to health centers where they can find care. So we work with the Ministry of Health because they make sure the services are available. So it's the relationship with the government is a relationship in our day-to-day work, if you want.
Mm-hmm.
Now, in terms of the administration, the change of the administration in the States, honestly, I'm not sure I can say a lot about that. I do hear from a lot of my colleagues and friends that there is the idea that both in close to President-elect Biden and Kamala Harris, there are a lot of Haitian Americans who have quite prominent positions.
That's
and
correct.
I think that actually it does give a lot of people here hope that the upcoming administration will be closer to the reality of Haiti and be more open to suggestions from Haiti, both in country and from the Haitian diaspora.
Mm-hmm.
That's a great point. Yes, that I believe the chief of staff of President-elect Harris is a Haitian American woman, and they're on her communications staff as well. So there are Haitian Americans. So I'm wary that representation means, but I'm hopeful. I think you're right. I think that is perhaps the avenue of sort of asking for change and collaborating.
Yeah, we know we've actually reported on this at the Haitian Times, where people just started immediately tweeting and sending emails and calling all of these, the Haitian Americans you mentioned in the administration, like as soon as the announcements were made. So it'll be interesting to see what the difference is in response like going forward. They know from speaking with friends and the folks we've interviewed, they are definitely very hopeful about having an ear, if not, particular solution. And so that in itself is a huge change from the last 4 years that we've experienced. So I think we have time for one more question, and then we'll need to wrap. This one is from someone named Sandrine Nozil. Sandrine is saying that there's still systemic racism, and certainly there's the color hierarchy that you see in Haiti. There are differences also around religion that I guess are impacting the country's way forward. So how do we address this, right, moving forward? There are things we're calling out here in the US around, colorism, systemic racism, racial inequality, communities, and how they've been devastated by COVID. It's all just been laid bare on so many levels, right? How do you see colorism manifesting now in Haiti or the US? And do you have any prescriptions for how to address them?
Oh, wow.
It's heavy. It's probably another conversation.
Yeah. I mean, I won't speak to colorism in contemporary Haiti simply because I don't live there on the ground. I know it exists and is a factor, and having discussions with family members, and I see it, but I don't want to kind of speak out of turn. But in the United States, it's definitely a feature of life here in the African American community, but also so inside the African American community, but also external to the African American community. It's not just a pressure of, it's not about social context, although that is a big factor as well. There's economic and material effects. And I think speaking more about it, I think I know in Haiti, it was harder to talk about it in the past, in the time period that I study, that people didn't like talking about it. So perhaps you could speak to if it's something that people can sort of have open conversations about. But I find in the United States that it's still really hard for people to want to have this conversation because it makes it seem like African Americans are being, or Black people in general in the US are being kind of turning inward and having to address their own sort of not infighting, but conflicts. And we have this huge other conflict, which is white supremacy. But what I always say is colorism is actually an arm of white supremacy. White supremacists created the color hierarchies. And so tackling colorism is actually a vital part of dismantling white supremacy, because if the idea is that the lighter a person's skin is, the more they're valued or seen as intelligent or more opportunities they get, then that is absolutely still a function of a white supremacist society. So I would like to see more open conversations where people listen and to one another, and rather than getting defensive, I would say, which is a lot of times what I see when the topic comes up.
Kind of, I'm curious to know how that comes up in your work and the women that you work with. Do you, like, how does it manifest? Do you see it?
Do I see it? I think there are prejudices attached to people's skin color in Haiti. That's for sure. I'm white, and so I'm considered a certain way. Young Haitian girls want to look lighter. These things go through the heads of people, and it's part of the background against which we live. It definitely influences our relationships. Now, I would also want to say, but very carefully, because I know it's a very sensitive subject, that in Haiti, people are disenfranchised not because of the color of their skin. They're disenfranchised because of their poverty. It's essentially access to material resources. And whether you live in Port-au-Prince or in an isolated rural area, and whether you're a young person and you went to the right school and not to a public school, that's what creates really disempowered people in Haiti today, I think, more than skin color.
Yeah, the manifestations of class and just that structure.
I think it is more a class issue than a color issue. And it's maybe one of the good things about Haiti, even if I kind of suspect a disproportionate percentage of people in the Haitian elite are lighter skins. There are quite a few darker skinned people who are part of the rich elite in Haiti too. So yeah, these things are difficult. I'm not sure we probably, as you were saying, Dr. Doe, we probably don't talk about it enough. And talking about it helps us understanding our own preconceptions and preconceived ideas around these kinds of social constructs. And I think that's important.
I think that's a huge takeaway as we wind down on time here, like having conversations, being open to having difficult conversations without being defensive, I think is a huge takeaway. So we'll be sure to note like how to help do that and have the resources and information to just, prod these conversations that are so key to dismantling all the different systems that keep us all well, I would say in eradicating inequality in its various forms. There are a few more questions we will not get to, unfortunately, but I'm really happy to see so many people engage in asking questions. We'll have to look at doing another one of these sometime soon. But I would like to wrap with a couple here that speak to what we can all do as individuals, right? As nonprofits or NGOs working in Haiti or in the US. What role can we play in making sure that we do our part in eradicating systemic inequality? I think having conversations is definitely one. but how else do you think at the individual and collective level can people help? That's for either of you.
You know, I would like to say, if we want to create a movement around this, we have to learn to work together. And working together is complicated because people don't think the same way, they don't talk the same way, they don't see the reality the same way, they don't have the same political ideas. And there's a lot of purism in these things, you know. So actually what we can do, and I'm talking for Fonkoze and for organizations too, is looking at more ways to partner instead of trying and doing everything ourselves. Partner with other NGOs, with private sector, with the government whenever we can, with community-based organizations and with the communities themselves. I think that's creating that collaboration, even if it is hard and it takes more time and it feels inefficient. I think that's a really, really big step forward if we could actually collaborate more. That's why it's called Fondation pour les Épaules, of course.
Yeah. No, that sounds great. So I've got at the individual level, very simple, is to be open to conversations and having those harder conversations. At the community or collective level, you know, being open to partnership and doing things differently than you have in the past in a formal way. And then Dr. Doe, I think earlier you said, you know, at the government level, right? I'm thinking of it in terms of like a ladder, individual, collective, and broad-based, putting pressure on the US and all these multilateral organizations to really do something different or act and work differently. What could we pressure them to actually do? What are some specific things that if we write to our Congress people here as Haitian Americans, or if we go to rallies at the UN, what could we be asking them to actually do?
I mean, it's a great question because I actually had a conversation with some people who were working for USAID at the time. This was a few years ago. And they said, you know, I had sort of given them my perspective on foreign NGOs in Haiti, which was not favorable. Like they hadn't really thought too much about this perspective. And I suggested some readings and they came back and said that it was really helpful. And I don't know how that translates into what you then do on the ground. But I think what Karine said is so important. People who want to quote unquote help Haiti have to work with Haitians, because if they think they know better and they're just going to tell Haitians how to do things and what's the best way, I don't think that that's effective. Because we have a lot of data from the last decades of the voluminous NGOs in Haiti, and we see that money is wasted. It doesn't go where it's supposed to go.
Right.
And I think it's related to a question that someone is asking in the chat, one of the journalists from the Haitian Times, about Vodou. And I think if sort of this idea of knowing better makes people want to go to Haiti to save them in concert with some religious project that is oftentimes tied to people's perceptions about Vodou, then we're already on the wrong path. So I would say, I don't know if it will be effective, but I was just thinking one thing that I could do is, you know, we write these pieces for the public sphere, but are the people we want and need to see them, are they seeing them? And how do we make sure that they see them? And so again, going back to, if this is the best time, the most access Haitian Americans have ever had in a US government administration, then maybe we need to really actually call these members who really rose to the heights that they are now through support from the Haitian community in Brooklyn, in the communities where they lived. That's how they got to the positions of prominence where they could even be in the US government. So now it's time for Haitian Americans to ask them for something back, and which is support for Haiti, listening and collaboration with the Haitian people, and opening that door so that can happen. So I do think this has been great for me in terms of thinking about some things that I can do actually also as we kind of move forward.
Yeah, I think that really wraps up everything pretty nicely. There's a lot more that we can get into. I think we have some outstanding questions around allyship and how to continue inspiring, the Black Lives Movement and being a part of that. But unfortunately, we are running out of time, so we will wrap today. Like I said, we'll have an email to anyone who registered via Zoom to share the resources with you. But to end it, I would just say that, remember today is a day of service, MLK Day. And so as you're going about your lives and thinking through 1804 Haitian independence and the Black Lives Matter movement, I think it's key to just think about how you personally can be of service to your community. And that community doesn't have to be, where you live right now, but it could be somewhere across the globe. It could be in Haiti. It could be with volunteering like organizations like Fonkoze, or sending in your opinion pieces to the Haitian Times. So that's my free plug. So yes, please stay engaged, keep up these conversations. We are on all socials at Haitian Times and at Fonkoze. So follow us, subscribe to our outlet, and please donate to Fonkoze. They're doing great work. They've been a wonderful partner. And so I congratulate them on the work that they're doing. And we look forward to doing this again. Thank you so much, Dr. Doe. And thank you, our audience and participants, for your time today. We appreciate you. Have a great day.
Thank you, everyone.
Take care.
Bye, everyone.